One of the things that is inherent to life is stress. There are things going on around us that we can't control. Things are flying everywhere. And most of the time, we don't have a clue about what to do about all of it. But somehow, we find a way and we manage to get through. Albeit in a pretty shaky manner, stressing all the way through, but we manage it. So is there any hope for us to move through life a little bit easier and without as much stress knocking us around? Well, no, there isn't. But it's not all bad news. There is some hope with a different approach that we can take to the different things in our lives that lead to us stressing about those things. I'd like to make a firm distinction in this video between stress and stressing. Similar to how there's a difference between pain and suffering, one is inevitable and one is optional. Here are my thoughts as to why we should be endeavoring each day to be stressing a little less. When we encounter a difficult situation in life, we can often have the inclination to be all consumed by whatever it is that is weighing on us in that moment. Whether it be an exam at school or university, a presentation or project at work, or even tension in a relationship. All of these things can tend to lead us into an attention vortex that kind of blinds us to the broader objective reality of the situation. If we had to look at it from more of a biological or evolutionary perspective, then it would make sense for most of our focus to be drawn towards the things that are causing friction or distress in our lives, because they very well could be the things that cause us irreparable damage or even death. I would say that this could probably be one of the major reasons as to why we've evolved to be so keenly aware of our surroundings and the things in our direct vicinity. Because when we think back to the ancestors of ours that didn't have this kind of anxiety, then there was probably a lot greater chance that they wouldn't survive until the next generation. Because sure, it's all good and fine to, be chill and not freak out about the things that come up in our lives. But if the thing that's creeping up on us is a saber-toothed tiger, then we're probably going to want to have a certain amount of heightened focus and attention to that thing to make sure that we can escape or do what we can to survive in that scenario, and to also have the proportional amount of anxiety built into our memory so that we can do what we can to avoid that situation in the future. One of the problems we have with things creeping up on us in more modern times is that they're less tangible, and therefore we struggle to know whether we've fully escaped the threat or not. We can see if there's a saber-toothed tiger next to us, but how do we really know if we've chosen the right career, or how do we know that we've chosen the right partner even? In short, we can't. So rather than going through the cycle of stressing and relaxing like we would have done on the plains of the savannah, rather we get stuck in the stressing phase because we're never quite sure when we can relax, because the threat is actually living in our heads. However, because our times are different from what we evolved to be adapted to, we also have to approach these situations differently as well. Before we look at what can help us to start managing these stresses in our lives, let's first look at what is called the stress reaction cycle. How the system is supposed to function is as follows: stimulus, appraisal, physiological response, relief. How the system ends up usually functioning when we're chronically stressing out is more similar to stimulus, appraisal, physiological response, internalization, maladaptive coping. So what happens in this modified stress reaction cycle is, rather than finding a conclusion and relief from the stresses in our lives, we instead develop these patterns that are in a way trying to compensate for our lack of ability to being able to truly resolve the problems that have been provided from these stresses. This can be seen in the forms of substance abuse, with overeating, smoking, alcoholism, or more behavioral traits of escaping into our work or recreation with overworking or underworking. All of these are termed to be maladaptive coping mechanisms because of the irony of their nature. We go to them to try to feel better through numbing or blinding ourselves to these stresses in our lives. But what they actually end up doing is further perpetuating the negative cycle we've been trying to escape. To spare ourselves all of the physiological details of the amygdala signaling the hypothalamus and the hypothalamus triggering the sympathetic nervous system and so on, all we need to know is that this cycle is very similar to blowing up a balloon. So if we are the balloon and we get stressed, then air gets put into the balloon and therefore it stretches. And when the stress gets taken away or it finishes, then it gives the balloon an opportunity to go back to a relaxed state and let all the air out. But what is happening in this modified stress reaction cycle is that the air isn't getting a chance to be let out. So then when there's another stressor and another stressor and another stressor and another stressor, the balloon keeps getting bigger and bigger, and it can only stretch so far until it has to pop. And that's what we call a mental breakdown. Now, a mental breakdown sounds like a pretty bad outcome, which in all respects, it usually is. However, a lot of the time, some people need to hit rock bottom to be able to realize that the way that they're living really isn't sustainable, and hopefully that prompts them to change. Another potential outcome that I would say can actually be worse than a mental breakdown is when we've been able to find just enough ways to keep our balloon on the edge from popping. So we're staying in this near fully stretched state for long periods of time. And in doing so, it's hard for us to truly experience some of the best things that life has to offer, such as peace or calm. At least with the mental breakdown, there's some freedom and a higher quality of life after the fact. Let's take a second to think about this in terms of performance. There's this thing called the Yerkes-Dodson Law, and kind of similarly to how the law of diminishing returns works, the way this works in the typical fashion of using something that looks pretty close to a bell curve, it can show us the optimal amount of stress to being able to get the highest amount of performance in any task that we're doing. If we're doing things in ways that are providing more stress than we're able to deal with, then it'd be like putting large amounts of air into the balloon all at once, having a chance to pop after only a few pumps. Another distinction I'd like to make lines up with the curve as well. There is helpful stress and hurtful stress, or as we can see with eustress and distress, our muscles and bones need appropriate amounts of stress to make sure they don't waste away, but too much can cause tear or fracture. Just like with our minds needing some amount of stress to function at their best, we don't need a constant barrage of anxiety-driven demands that results in us running ourselves into the ground. The main message here is that stress isn't bad, and that, in fact, it can actually be quite a healthy and necessary part of being able to do our best in whatever it is that we're doing. However, when we fall into these unhelpful routines of doing or having some stressful thing put into our lives, and we follow it up with one of these maladaptive coping mechanisms, then we're heading for trouble sooner or later. We have to be mindful of what we are doing, and more specifically, how we are approaching the stress that comes into our life. There may be a certain upper limit that we can't surpass, but we can tweak our immediate capability of our day-to-day actions. So the question becomes, well, how can we tweak our day-to-day lives so we're stressing less? There are things that work for some and not so well for others. There's no singular, simple framework or pathway or hack that's going to work for everybody. This is a deeply personal journey that we all have to dig deep back into our minds to try to find what's going to work for us through trial and error. Now, I don't have all the answers to pretty much any of these questions, but there is a few things that we can start with to get the ball rolling. Well, there are the classic recommendations, such as going for a run, simulating to evade that saber-toothed tiger. And in the process, we're kind of fooling our brain into thinking that we've gotten away for a certain amount of time. Stimulating some oxytocin with a hug of a family member or a friend. Oxytocin has been found to lower blood pressure and to also increase a sense of comfort and well-being. Or through making sure that we're getting a good night's sleep. because sleep is one of the most restorative things that we have access to. And when we don't get that right, then it's almost like we're letting our balloon become brittle. So even the smallest pump of air can push us over the edge. Sleep is the one that I've definitely fallen short on more than I'd like to admit. However, we all know these things. They're pretty much common knowledge at this point. So there's one other thing that I've been using that I've found has been really great in helping me to develop an awareness of when I've fallen into these traps. There's a famous quote by Reinhold Niebuhr that has many different versions, but this is my favorite one. Grant me the strength to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. The reason why utilizing this kind of mantra works so well is that it helps to broaden our perspective. Because when we're in the silo of our own minds, things can really seem like the end of the world, or that nothing's going to get better after this. That guy at work probably wasn't trying to sabotage your whole career. He probably just forgot something, or his mind was elsewhere. That partner that has suddenly gone cold on you for no apparent reason probably isn't any less in love with you, but they may just be going through something themselves. Or take the embarrassing thing that happened to you in front of that group of people. No, they aren't going to hate you. They aren't going to exclude you because of that. And even if they did, then that isn't the kind of group of people that you're wanting to be associating yourself with anyway. So regardless, it's okay. When we take this broader perspective, we can more accurately weigh up how we should respond to any situation. Because when we're stuck in our tunnel vision, then it can really quite easily seem all too much. We need to be able to recognize that most of the problems that we encounter on a day-to-day basis aren't worthy of disrupting our peace or taking away our optimism. This is something that I have to be mindful of each and every day, catching myself when I fall into a hole of stressing myself out. But the most important part is to be able to take a step back and see when we've done that so we can remedy it. And each time we catch ourselves, the easier it's going to be next time. As I'm a 24-year-old student still trying to figure everything out, take everything I've said in this video with a grain of salt, because in no way do I have all of the answers or mastery over the cosmos. But these are simply just a snapshot into what I've found has been useful for me, what has worked for me, and I'm hopeful that for the handful of people that are going to watch this, that it will be beneficial for you. Regardless, thanks for your attention. I appreciate you watching. I'll see you next week.